Okay, so welcome everybody to our talk on the Visual Effects Reference Platform, and a big thank you to the Academy of Software Foundation for inviting us to talk here today. So my name is Nick Cannon. I'm the CTO at Walt Disney Animation Studios, and I'm also going to be joined shortly by Francois Chardavoine, who's the VP of Technology at Lucasfilm. But today we're not representing our employers. Today we're representing the Visual Effects Society Technology Committee, and specifically our roles as co-leads of the VFX Reference Platform initiative. And it's important to make that distinction because we're here representing not just Visual Effects Society members, but the whole community of software developers, of consumers, artists, studios. And so that's the context in which we're kind of presenting and talking to you today. And what we want to talk to you about over the next kind of 45 minutes or so is a little bit about what the platform is and a recap. And even for those of you who think you know what it is, or you do know what it is, hopefully you'll be able to share something that you didn't know before. A little bit about how it works inside and how the process works, what's new. And we have some big announcements today that we're excited to share. And then a little bit about what's next, what we see for the future. And then hopefully we have time at the end for questions and discussion as well. So what is the VFX Reference Platform? At a very high level, it's a set of tool and library versions to be used as a common target platform for building software for the VFX and animation industry. It's a neutral and independent volunteer effort sponsored by the VS and run for the benefit of the VFX community. And again, this is really important to note, like we do want to be independent. It is a community-driven effort. So so these events are super important to us. We update the platform annually, but there's a lot of activity that happens through the year. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And it's initially been focused on Linux, and that's been a big part of the initial goals because that's where a lot of the issues that we were trying to solve were appearing. But before we go deeper into kind of what the platform is and why it was needed, it's important to understand a little bit of the history. So we'll do a little bit of a history lesson and we're going to go back 20 years to the year 2000, if we can remember that far back. And what was happening in the year 2000 is really high-end computer graphics had really been owned by Silicon Graphics, SGI to that point. And 2000 was really seeing the emergence of Linux as a serious platform for digital content creation. And what we saw in year 2000, 2001 were the release of Houdini 4, which is the first release on Linux, Shake 2.1, which was the big compositing package of the time, released on Linux. And the following year, Maya 4 released on Linux for the first time. So suddenly we had a suite of serious digital content creation tools available on Linux. And this marked the beginning of a really fundamental change in the economics of running studios, because suddenly it commoditized the cost of hardware and the availability and accessibility of these tools. And that meant suddenly you had more and more artists wanting to collaborate together. And that became more of an overhead of that collaboration. How do we ease that collaboration? We want to start creating pipeline tools, glue code, to kind of connect these different tools together to enable easy transfer of data. And when you want to start writing tools that connect to all these different software packages, you want to make sure there's some level of compatibility between them. And guess what? The compatibility was an issue, and we saw the beginnings of a problem that was later dubbed versionitis, where you write a bit of software that works with one product, but then there's an incompatibility with another product, and so you can't. It makes it hard to create these tools that can glue everything together seamlessly without these compatibility issues. This became such a big issue that in 2005, the kind of studios got together, and really under the leadership of Ray Feeney at the time, the Studio Linux initiative was created. And you can, if you don't know about it, you can check it out on archive.org, the Wayback Machine, studio-linux.com. This was a kind of an effort to try and coordinate Linux versions that people were using, the Linux distros and the versions of distros they were using between the vendors and the customers. And it definitely helped to some extent. But unfortunately, this was a challenging problem, and the problem of versionitis continued to grow to the point where in 2011, SIGGRAPH, the first SIGGRAPH in Vancouver, that was, I think, versionitis was big enough to get its very own birds of a feather. And that was a packed room in a hotel. I remember that well, and lots of heated discussion. People felt passionate about it because people were suffering on a day-to-day basis. And what people were experiencing was upgrading versions of software was really painful, and sometimes almost impossible. And it's certainly impractical, with a huge amount of engineering overhead in doing that. And it was meaning that the industry was slow to adopt new technologies. And we were starting to stagnate. We were starting to, because it was so much effort just to upgrade a component, we were not doing it, and so the industry was being held back from new features. So the following year, under the leadership of Rob Brito, the Visual Effects Society Technology Committee kind of rebooted and reformed, and we were looking at ways that we could help the industry. And versionitis was a hot issue at the time. But hey, we think we can do something about this. We met with the software vendors, or some of the major software vendors, at an Autodesk-hosted CTO meeting with all the studios in 2013. We proposed a way forward with the VFX Reference Platform and sought feedback, and there was a lot of input from technology leaders and other software vendors as well, and other discussions we were having, that really led to the formation of the VFX Reference Platform that was launched in 2014. So at this point, I'll hand over to Francois, who can tell us more about it.
Yeah. So I think Nick hinted at this, but one aspect that's really specific, I think, about visual effects and animation on the Linux platform is this notion of integrated pipelines, where a lot of studios, the industry at large, uses multiple major third-party applications, essentially binary blobs on Linux that we use for content creation. These are the Maya, Houdini, Katana, Nuke, etc. And they're often treated as pipeline development platforms. So their functionality is heavily extended by proprietary plugins. These plugins are built on shared libraries that are now used across multiple applications. And in turn, those plugins are often rely on additional third-party libraries like Qt, Python, TBB, or industry libraries like OpenEXR, OpenVDB. And previously, there really was no coordination between vendors on versions, which meant there was so much effort spent in trying to build multiple targets, coordinating across compatibilities on the code side, not to mention the runtime side. And this burden of support was extremely high. It was a large portion of what a lot of us in the industry were doing. So the goal here and why it was needed was really to minimize incompatibilities between software packages and find common ground for reducing the software development friction that everybody entails, so that everybody can actually focus on what we care about, which is pushing the state of the art, and not this business of kind of bureaucratic management of software versions. And overall, it essentially encourages a healthy Linux ecosystem in this kind of unique aspect where we combine open source with binary software for all of our day-to-day. So how does this actually work in practice? Obviously, a lot of you I've seen from the participants are familiar with this, but essentially at its core, we have the Visual Effects Society's Technology Committee, which I'd say organizes the process of decision-making and the communication around it, but it's truly independent across all vendors and users and studios, and not just Academy Software Foundation members. Obviously, this is kind of a new development, which is extremely beneficial, but has been ongoing regardless. And we coordinate with, let me just move the slide. We coordinate with 3 of the major vendors. This is Autodesk, Foundry, and SideFX, essentially because these are some of the larger software packages or vendors that we all rely on. And if we start there, it's a lot easier for everyone else to kind of tack onto that. This set of vendors is not fixed in time. That could evolve over time, but it certainly was the best starting point for all of us to get to agree. If we could agree across the 3 vendors and the visual effects and animation industry as a whole, we had already made a ton of progress here. And essentially, this is openly communicated. This is an open process where we communicate this to VFX Platform Discuss, which is a Google group that is open to everyone. And we really encourage as much feedback and participation as possible and revisit that feedback in an iterative process. More recently, with the Academy Software Foundation coming in, as always, the philosophy for us is to be facilitators and not necessarily evangelists, and get everyone to participate in the process to reach the best possible compromise for everyone. And that compromise can mean the difference between leaning forward and pushing the industry forward, or minimizing change and the burden for both software vendors and industry participants, studios that have to deal with it. And a more recent aspect, which is puts all of this in practice, is the continuous integration working group as part of the Academy Software Foundation, which helps automate the process of builds targeting the Visual Effects Reference Platform, and essentially validates a lot of those decisions and prove that they continuously work and run tests against those targets. So it's not just putting out a white paper saying the versions, it's actually kind of testing them out. This is like a real validation framework that we hope to leverage, and also beneficial for a lot of studios that over time may not have large software and R&D groups and can leverage some of these artifacts more directly. And philosophically, I think this is an ongoing challenge. I think it's been really productive, the discussions we've had over the years in terms of that balance of leaning forward versus compromise. Recent ones that have been extremely informative have been with the Blender community, for instance, that prides itself on leaning forward, but that we see a lot more studios wanting to adopt, and finding what the right blend is that doesn't compromise innovation for the software vendors that really want to push forward, but also increases adoption and use in that space. So the general schedule and how we go about it, again, a lot of you are familiar with this, but essentially we target a calendar year. And so shortly after the calendar year begins, we start planning for what the platform is going to be for the year after that. And we get together as a group, the small group that you saw with the subset of vendors and us as representatives from the VFX and animation community. And then we publish this first draft publicly. There's nothing that's set in stone at this point. It's essentially, we've gotten a lot of big players to agree at least on this. What does everyone else think? And we give a lot of room for just community feedback and iterating on some of the points where we should lean forward, where we shouldn't. And we have essentially a first community meeting that typically is around SIGGRAPH time. It doesn't have to be, but obviously it really helps to have more opportunity to discuss in person where possible. So that's essentially what we're doing both now and next week. And then shortly after SIGGRAPH, we officially published a final draft, or the final version of what should be targeted for software that is built and released in the next calendar year. Now, in some instances, there's late-breaking changes. These are not weighed lightly. These really need the general approval of the community to make changes. There's a few instances where we know that there's some packages we rely on that release later. OpenVDB is a good example of that. And we can sort of agree to it sooner that we'll target a later release. But we also have to keep in mind that it's extremely onerous for large software vendors to suddenly make changes, especially if they tend to release software early in the year, in the calendar year. Now, potentially they will only have a couple months to make changes. And we really have to balance the overall needs of what we're trying to achieve. So what's new for next year? Let's see. Did this go backwards? No. Here we go. A lot of the major recent changes that we've looked at recently have been essentially setting the C++ default build version. We went from C++ 11, which also included a Qt5 change. These are some of the major changes that we don't want to do too often. We often leapfrog years to give people some time to adopt and deploy and upgrade their pipelines before a major change. 2 years later here, we upgraded the C++ standard as well as GCC 6. And then last year, essentially this calendar year, Python 3 was the big push. This is something that we had been kind of punting down the road little by little each year, given how hard it was going to be for both studios and vendors to adopt. But we knew we'd have to deal with it sooner or later. So we set a line in the sand, and then we moved that line by 1 year, and then we actually did it. Now is really the time where everybody's pushing for Python 3, and that was just a major milestone where the hope was to not change too much across a couple of years to give people a chance to upgrade to Python 3. So now for next calendar year, a couple of the things that we're talking about and that we're proposing and gathering feedback on are the question of which Python 3 version, 3.7 versus 3.8. Again, the kind of pros and cons around leaning forward. We're going to tackle some of the questions around Qt licensing and what does that mean in terms of choosing a version and choosing a licensing, and whether the choice of licensing should be specified in the platform. More importantly, and this has been an ongoing topic, we're hoping to look beyond Linux at other platforms. I won't steal Nick's thunder on this. And more generally, easing kind of build and deployment opportunities by looking at the Academy Software Foundation Docker efforts. And Nick, I'll hand it back to you for the rest.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francois. Okay, so what we're seeing right here is this is the platform. So these are the different components, and this is where we stand today, calendar year 2020. Obviously, the big change moving to Python 3.7. And so, what does 2021 look like? And this is still a draft for us. But here's the 2021 components, and I know that's a bit of an eye chart. So let's kind of highlight some of the big changes. And so the changes here are highlighted in orange, and some of the bolder ones that I just want to call out. Some big changes. This is still a draft, so and we're not going to finalize the platform for another 3 to 4 weeks. So there's still, part of us doing this event today is to kind of invite you to give us feedback. Do you see any issues? Do you have any concerns with this? But I'll first call out the C compiler and C++ at the bottom there. So we're taking a big leap this year from GCC 6 to GCC 9. And that's going to give us C++ 17, which has been, we've had a vocal group of people who've been asking for this, really wanting to modernize development practices in the industry. And so we're very happy to be proposing this move to GCC 9 and C++ 17. And also wanted to call out kind of OpenEXR and OpenColor.io. They've given their talks already, over the last today and yesterday, and there's major releases coming, and so it's really exciting. I've been involved in this initiative from the beginning and seen some of these components stagnate. So it's particularly rewarding to see these major releases, and really as a result of the great work the Academy Software Foundation is doing in kind of nurturing and sponsoring, kind of reinvigorating these projects. So I just want to call out that's great to see. Something that's not highlighted that I want to call out as well is, so far we're saying Python 3.7 is going to be Python 3.7 for next year as well. And I'm already seeing questions coming in the Q&A, and thanks, Naren. I'll get to those. Why moving to 3.8? I'll talk about that in a little bit. And one other note I'll say, we've been, as we talked about in the history, we've been behind the curve for a long time. And I think, give or take 1 or 2, maybe, what we're proposing right here is really getting to the latest major version of almost all the components. And that really is a significant milestone. It's taken us maybe sort of 7 years to get here. But what this really gives is we've managed to coordinate a change to be on kind of modern components and unlocking all those capabilities. So, and that's been due to the great kind of input and collaboration, cooperation from the software vendors and the studios as well. So let's get into that question about Python 3.7 or 3.8. So Python 3.7 was new this year. We were talking about Python 3. I think since 2005, I remember a meeting where we were talking about Python 3000, and it's like, no way are we doing that. That's crazy. So it took us 15 years. We got to Python 3. Better late than never, maybe. But when we're definitely hearing many community requests for us to move to 3.8. Definitely recognize, like, that's what the community, the majority of people are asking for. But there's some practicalities around that, which I want to talk about. The migration from Python 2 is going to take some time. The vendors have done a lot of work over the last 12 months to be able to accommodate Python 3 in their products. It's not straightforward because of some of the things they have to link against. Like USD is highly complex, Boost is complex, and so it means changing Python interpreters versions is challenging. Most vendors actually have 2 builds now. They'll have a Python 2 build and a Python 3.7 build. And it's going to take a while for the customers, for the big studios, to migrate these enormous Python 2 code bases to Python 3. I will say, like, hopefully everyone here from any studio, you have your Python 3 migration plan in progress right now, because you're going to be left adrift in a year or two if you don't get moving. And there is a fantastic a new resource now under the Academy Software Foundation. They have a Python 3 working group. If you want help or input or guidance on best practices around Python 3 migration, definitely check that out and sign up for the Slack channels and meetings there. But the reality is, like, the software vendors are having to support Python 2 build and a Python 3.7 build for at least next year. And it support, for every build they have to support, it has a significant overhead in the amount of build resources they have, just in terms of compute, of, like, you know, they're doing frequent builds of these very large pieces of software. All the QA they have to do, the testing, the logistics around support and all that kind of thing. And there's high complexity around it. Now, the vendors are like, they're saying, hey, look, if the community really wants us to go to Python 3.8, like, we'll do it. But there's a very significant trade-off involved in doing that. And that is that the more testing and integration they're doing, the more overhead that they have, means they have less engineering resource to create the new features that the artists want and that their customers are asking for. So they're really going to listen to their customers, you know. So you know, it's not yes, please give us feedback, but speak to the software vendors. If you're a customer, a paying customer of a software vendor, and you want them to move to Python 3.8, and that's more important to you than seeing more features in the next version, let them know. So far, you know, that's the consensus being people we talk to. It's like, actually, do you know what? We're still in this transition. Maybe it's better to stay on Python 3.7 just for one more year. So that's what we're recommending. Stay on Python 3.7, but let's use that year to work towards dynamic Python loading in the big DCC products, so that they can more interchangeably switch out different Python versions without this significant overhead. And all the vendors, they want to get to the point, and hear the feedback, they want to get to the point where we can stay on the latest Python each year. So that is absolutely the goal. It's just maybe too quick to do that for next year. And something else we're looking into as well is there is some limited binary interface compatibility between Python 3 versions. So we are looking into that. It's a fairly limited API. We're not sure if that's going to be useful or not, but that's also something, potentially another angle into giving some more flexibility around Python releases. So that's quite a bit around Python. I've seen a whole bunch of questions pop up, so we'll get to that in the Q&A, and we'll talk more about it. The next one, an even more fun topic, Qt licensing. So I will just preface this by saying I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. This is just sharing some information for awareness in case you weren't already aware of some changes in Qt licensing. So what isn't new is that Qt is, sorry, I say Qt and not cute. It's a habit. I can't break it. So Qt is dual licensed. You have to pay for a commercial license, and if you don't, then you're using the open source license. And that open source license changed with Qt 5.7 a couple of years ago, changed from LGPL version 2 to LGPL version 3. That does have implications for certain types of uses of Qt. Shouldn't really in our industry, but if you're not sure, if you're questioning about it, it's worth checking out, particularly if you distribute products, particularly for embedded applications. So check out, they've got a great frequently asked questions document on their website, which explains more about the implications of that change. And then there was another change just in January of this year, that the Qt company announced that the long-term support releases are only going to be available for commercial licensees from Qt 5.15. And the majority of licensees in our industry, and even with the software vendors, tend to use the open source license. I think there are some that use commercial licensees, most open source. And again, there's a link there where you can see more about this change. And this one does have implications. Qt 5.15 was released in May, and they've committed to keep support and point releases for Qt 5.15 up until the release of Qt 6. But Qt 6 is slated for release as soon as the end of this year. So I think, and this is personal speculation only on for me, I think probably can expect another year of support from for Qt 5.15 for open source licensees. And so this is an issue for not just for our industry, it's for all open source Qt licensees. This has been a big discussion. We're keeping in touch with the community. We're seeing what happens in this space. You know, the move from Qt 4 to Qt 5 was a tremendous effort for the software vendors, and that represented a year where we saw fewer new features coming out because they were putting lots of engineering effort into that. Qt6 is likely to be a similar kind of transition, and we're not going to rush into that by any means. And we've made good use of the long-term support releases in the past by sticking with a version of Qt for 2 to 3 years. So this is something that we will be watching out for. It's something we'll be talking about over the next year, but I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of this change. Okay, so now the exciting bit, beyond Linux. So very much focused on Linux initially. Lots of requests for macOS and Windows support, and so from next year we will be supporting macOS and Windows. But what does that mean in the context of the VFX Reference Platform? It's really about binary. Like can we express with the platform a kind of a platform that's kind of offers a high degree of binary compatibility. And the way we do that for Linux is that we have GCC, we specify GCC and glibc, the compiler version and the SDK version. So maybe we should do the same thing for macOS and Windows. So we spent the last few months doing a bunch of research into this and trying to work out what the appropriate way of doing things for each of those platforms is. Let's talk about macOS first. So Xcode, the IDE in this ecosystem, has something called in their project called the deployment target, and that identifies the earliest operating system version on which your software can run. So that seems like a good basis on which to say, okay, well that's a solid foundation. It gives you an API compatibility. And it's not just an Xcode on the command line with Clang, the compiler. There's a flag there, and that really specifies the APIs that are marked as available when building. And then in the linker, they specify that flag there, and that really instructs the linker to create a key in the info.plist file, which marks the executable as being able to run or not for a given OS. You can set those things to be different. You really shouldn't, I think, is the consensus. It doesn't really make much sense. And what about the compiler version? Well, Xcode can install older or newer SDKs. So it turns out there's really no need for us to be able to specify an Xcode version. The minimum of that, if we already specify a deployment target, then that already implies what versions of Xcode are going to work or not. So really, it turns out, and making it simple, but macOS support is as simple as us defining what the minimum deployment target is in Xcode or with those command line options, and we're saying that's going to be 10.13 for CY 2021. And just to be clear, this is the SDK version. This is the set of APIs. This is not the OS version. So the minimum OS version that'll be supported by the various DCC products that Ben has released, that's really up to them. So clearly it can't be older than 10.13 at this point, but they may want to say it's 10.14 or 10.15 for whatever reasons that they may have internally to want to do that. So again, we're not saying the minimum OS is going to be guaranteed to be 10.13. This is really about API compatibility. So that's macOS. Oh, and a little footnote on this. We're in our first year with this, so we'll see how we go. But it is still possible for runtime behavior to be affected by the SDK and OS versions, and for what hardware you're using and that kind of thing. We're not sure how much of an issue this is going to be, and we'll see how we go, basically. So again, it'll be year one for us next year. We'll learn and we'll adapt the way we specify for macOS if we need to. Okay, Windows. This has also been made easier for us in recent years than it was in the past when we'd looked at it. So ABI compatibility has been stable since Visual Studio 2015, which makes things much more straightforward. And it turns out there's 3 key components for VFX Reference Platform support for Windows. First of all, you got the Windows SDK, and actually V10 has been the latest since Visual Studio 2015. If we wanted to go back and guarantee support for Vista and Windows 7, we could specify 8.1, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of desire to want to do that. So we're going to specify V10 as the Windows SDK. And the next one is essentially the compiler version. It's the platform toolset. Visual Studio 2015, 2017, 2019, they all use Visual C++ 14. And any software built by any C++ 14 compiler is fully backwards ABI compatible. So So we can use any of those platforms, but we also want to specify the C++ language standard, which we already have in the platform, and we're saying we want to make it at C++ 17 for next year. And actually, that's not supported by Visual Studio 2015. It's mostly supported from Visual Studio 2017. So that's what the Windows support looks like. If we add with the Windows SDK of version 10 and the platform toolset of Visual Studio 2017, that gives us the Windows support. And what does this all look like? We bring it all together. The platform for next year, we've split out the Linux components. So we now have a section for Linux, a section for macOS, a section for Windows, and then the common components that apply to every operating system. This will be reflected on the website just as soon as I hit sync after this. So probably from just after midday Pacific time anyway, the vfxplatform.com website will be updated with all of this. There's also a footnote there explaining a little bit more about the macOS aspects of it as well. So yeah, check that out. Moving on from that, the Academy Software Foundation Docker project. This was, Francois referred to this, it was talked about more extensively at the CI working group talk yesterday, so check that out if you're interested to know more about it. But I just want to call this out because it's a fantastic resource. It offers automated builds of all of recent VFX reference platforms in really easy to consume Docker images. All at least for Linux, the CY 2021 components are all available now for you to build against. Definitely the plan is for them to be able to offer macOS and Windows builds in future as well. We're standing up all the infrastructure to do that. So that's great. And what that's meant for us from the platform perspective is much faster validation. When we first published the draft in May for 2021, Alois, who's doing the bulk of the work, and I just have to say a huge thank you to Alois for his work on this project. It's a huge contribution he's made to the community. So I just want to recognize all his efforts. But so he took the 2021 components, put them in system, did some automated builds, came up with some issues and with some bugs, and that helped us tweak the platform and have really valuable feedback. And it would have been the kind of thing that maybe we wouldn't have caught until September, October of previous years. So that's been hugely useful. It's also useful as a source of kind of reference builds. So if you want to know what compiler flags to use, that kind of thing, then again, check out the Docker project. We want that to be the kind of canonical reference for how to build these components in a sensible way. Okay, so that's what's new. A little bit about what's next. The first thing is kind of operating system trends. Just something we're seeing. Obviously, it's great now we're supporting the three major operating systems. What we're also seeing is the lines are starting to blur between the operating systems, between containerization and Windows system for Linux as well, which is significant development, and potential support there for CUDA and other things. There's some really interesting opportunities there, and how we can potentially blend some of these different OS capabilities together. So that's something we're keeping an eye on and seeing what that means. But that's exciting. The other thing is just something. It's nothing urgent, but something to keep an eye on for the further future is Linux specifically. All these complex DCCs, these digital content creation tools that we have that rely on very complex display mechanics and accelerated graphics. They're very reliant on OpenGL and X11. Both OpenGL and NX11 are being also the X11 is being deprecated, and the industry is really going to need to come together to work out how do we continue to have a healthy Linux ecosystem for these really complex desktop applications that use high-end graphics. So that's just something for us to think about and talk about over the next few years. Qt6 is going to be a big one. Like I said before, there's now shorter support for the open source licensees. Qt6 is likely to be a big upgrade with significant effort, and what's going to be the timing around that. So something to keep an eye on. And then something else was mentioned in the CI working group yesterday. Cross-platform portable package definitions is something that we don't have any kind of standards for right now, and it's something that we're definitely sorely needed, because it's starting to be something that's creating a big administrative overhead. So some of the contenders there: Res, Conda, Conan, Res is great for studios. Some studios using it already. Conan's being used. I know Foundry talked a little bit about that in their talk. They've been making great use of Conan. So, the great thing is, the software vendors are talking with each other, facilitated through the VFX Reference Platform working group, through the Academy Software Foundation CI working group. So we really have this good ecosystem of like coordination and facilitation of how do we harmonize and standardize on some of these things. So I'm optimistic about that one. I think that's kind of bringing us to our conclusion. So it's really over to you at this point. Again, we're a community-driven initiative. We really rely on you, on feedback from you. So please reach out to us. Please, share with us kind of what your needs are, what your challenges are. How can the VFX Reference Platform help? In the context of us really tackling versionitis as the issue. Let the software vendors know what is important to you, and often, yes, studios will tell them about what features they want and that kind of thing, but make sure they know what the issues from a platform perspective. What are the challenges for software integration? What do you want from them from Python versions or whatever it may be? So don't hold back in sharing that with them. They can only respond to what they're hearing. Just as a general note, please get involved with open source projects, contribute to those that you care about. Again, the platform's only as healthy as the components that it represents. And by the way, our ideal is that the components get healthy enough that they can fall out of the platform at some point. There are plenty of great open source packages and components that are essential to our industry that are not in the VFX Reference Platform because they're incredibly well behaved and don't cause any version issues. So that's another note just to point out. And then final note, like if you care about a healthy, sustainable Linux ecosystem, then advocate for that and support the Linux distribution providers and make sure that they know what your needs are, and make sure that the software vendors know that you care about Linux as an important platform. Which we've been used as our primary platform for 20 years now, because it offers such a fantastic development environment and such a great environment for connecting these kind of disparate applications together into these kind of seamless artist pipelines and collaboration pipelines. So that's it. I just have to say thank you to a few people. So Autodesk, Foundry, Side Effects Software, who've really been our partners in the VFX Reference Platform. The Academy Software Foundation for all the great work they're doing, the VS for sponsoring us, and the tech committee who's done a great job of spinning out this initiative. Rob, Ray, and David, who were really instrumental in the creation of the VFX Reference Platform. And I won't read everyone's name in the middle there, but these are these are contributors who've made a particular contribution over the last year, or support in the last year, particularly with some of the support of Windows and macOS as well. And really just to thank you to all members of our community, representing the VFX Platform Discuss. And by the way, that can be anyone. So please sign up to that Google group. There's a link coming up for that in a moment, in fact, probably right now. And that really brings us to the end. So just throw it open to questions. I know we've got a whole bunch in the Q&A section there, which I haven't had a chance to look at because I've been busy talking. So maybe I'll hand over to Francois and he can start tackling some of those, and I'll take a look at them too.
Sure, and thank you very much for all of that. There's a couple questions actually that tie into a general concept around the VFX Reference Platform that might be worth clarifying. That a lot of the motivation for the platform is to help specify to software vendors, and in particular commercial software vendors, at least initially, what is the common target, because that is the one that we least control as a community and as an industry compared to, say, open source packages that have come out of our industry. And it's really for the vendors to agree on a set of versions to target, and less on mandates for everybody consuming. We're not telling studios how to run their own internal facilities and which versions they should use. We're only telling vendors to minimize the matrix of possible versions that we have to deal with as clients, essentially, so that then you can choose within your studios what to use or not. And the list of libraries or components that are in the VFX Reference Platform are the ones that are problematic. If there isn't a problem with something, there's no point in specifying it. Or if there isn't necessarily a clean resolution, something that's continuously evolving. USD is a good question of something that's come up recently as when do we set the version? And the reality is it's been shifting so much recently that there isn't a lot of value in the short term, but there will be at some point. and we've done that. But the certain questions around, for instance, mandating CMake, there's no point in telling, you know, an isotropics or an Autodesk, you should use CMake, which is essentially a lot of what the goals of the reference platform are. And some of the common guidelines for open source software for our industry, like standardizing on CMake, that's an area where the Academy Software Foundation can play a really large role in promoting more of a standard around how we build things. And that's where questions around like Res and Conda and Conan and others come in as well. So that tackles a little bit, I think, the question around CMake. And then the other one, which is around OpenGL is versus Vulkan is an example where it's a challenge to deal with, but mandating a single version is not necessarily going to solve the challenge as it is. And in the past, that hasn't been a problem. There hasn't been a vendor that's used a different version of OpenGL that suddenly prevents us from compiling kind of standard libraries. There's individual issues, of course, that come up, but not at the scale where it bubbles up to being like an active member of the list, I would say.
Great, thanks, Francois. I'll tackle just some of the questions I can answer pretty quickly. How does one join the Python 3 working group? So currently the Python 3 working group has 2 representatives from each of the VS Tech committee, so that's Francois and I, 2 from Autodesk, 2 from Side Effects, and 2 from Foundry. And we kept it at that intentionally for the first few years, just to make sure we have some stability and a common understanding. And I think that group's really working really well now. And so we would, I think, consider opening that up a little, not to make public, but potentially adding representatives from, if you represent a software vendor, then absolutely, you contact us, feedback@vfxplatform.com, send us an email, and we can have a discussion around potential inclusion, and also maybe in the future there's potential to add there's the potential to add some representatives of the open source community as well. Or the other sort of stakeholders who aren't really represented are maintainers of some of the bigger open source projects as well. So, but we don't want to make this too big. The working group, keeping the working groups relatively small and contained is important, because we develop a trust where each of the vendors who really, sometimes there's some competitive nature between them. They actually got to a point where they're quite open and sharing. It really kind of helps them all out and helps us all out. So we don't want to make it so big that they feel like they can't share openly. So that's one of the considerations. Two of the other questions are around the providing of RPMs from the automated build system. I think it would be great to do that. That's not something for the VFX Reference Platform. That's really something to take to the CI, the Academy Software Foundation's CI working group. It's them who are building that build infrastructure, and who have potentially the ability to be able to do that. So definitely suggest taking that to them.
And a key challenge there is also in maintaining flexibility in how you might want to use those build artifacts, where RPMs is probably not the most flexible approach for a lot of facilities that actually do have to install multiple versions in parallel, link against them in parallel, and probably dynamically set a runtime environment that has to use a certain combination based on their preference. And that's where it bleeds into things like Res and other packages. And that's been an ongoing topic of discussion of how much of an active role does the VFX Reference Platform play in specifying or mandating a means in how to use those binary artifacts that might be provided. And it's a complex one that there isn't a lot of common alignment, but it's another area where, again, the Software Foundation can play a major role, given that the CI group is tackling this head on. And there's a somewhat related, just because of the RPM aspect, question around coordination with the distros. And we've often done, especially at these kinds of groups, every year, a survey around who's using what distro. Overwhelmingly, they have been Red Hat based or a variant, like CentOS or Fedora. And so that's essentially been the default. And in terms of coordination, there hasn't been a lot of effort in active coordination for upstream seeding of versions that we care about. Where the biggest coordination comes in is making sure that the choices we make will be easy to deploy or use or implement based on what a general current version is in the industry. And so looking at, for instance, the DTS compatibility with Red Hat or CentOS versions, and will you even be able to use GCC 6 on the common platform in the industry. And that's the area where we've fostered a lot more kind of conversation and iteration. We haven't, to this point, actively pushed on the distros themselves. Some of that is also a timing issue, that at the time when distros make choices, we tend to lag like a year plus behind those, where we make a decision, software vendors have to implement them, then we start deploying it in production, which often takes its own time, sometimes up to a year. And now you're a couple years down the road from when some of those decisions would have been made at the distro level, which makes that challenging.
Great. Another working group question, sorry, that I think may have misunderstood. How do you join the Python 3 working group? There's definitely a Slack channel in the ASWF Slack workspace, so you can certainly join that to get some activity. And then I think I think the meetings go to the TAC mailing list. So I think that. Another question was around Qt 5.12, and are we looking to try and get bug fixes backported to 5.12? This is a kind of an ongoing, I would say, an ongoing dialogue between the vendors who are commercial licensees of Qt, working with the Qt company to try and get that done. Like any organization, the Qt company are getting lots of requests from all over the place, and they're going to listen more to the commercial licensees and also open source licensees, and they're going to make decisions about what they want to do. So again, the VFX Reference Platform, what that does give us the ability to engage with the Qt company and bring the collective leverage of the industry as a whole. And so we've not really made good necessarily needed to make good use of that, but a few years ago, definitely. I mean, the Qt company, well, I guess when it was just when I think it was Digia, but there was a good engagement with us at SIGGRAPH, and they've certainly been open to feedback and that kind of thing. So so yes, but I think the Qt company are really moving on. If they're focused on Qt 6 right now. And another question, any long-term thoughts starting to come out for other platforms such as mobile or web-based tools, applications? Not really. Honestly, we've been very focused on Windows and Mac. And again, so far the goal of the goals of the VFX Reference Platform have been focused on solving the issue of versionitis and helping ensure we have a healthy Linux ecosystem for the industry. And so those goals may evolve over time, but so far we haven't really had any, and if there are issues out there in the community around web development or development for mobile, let us know. If we can help, they're definitely interested in looking at that, but we've not heard anything about that so far.
There was one question as well from Eric about whether or not we were thinking about collecting data on what the usage breakdown is of various VFX reference platform versions of previous years in the wild, and how much we should be driving, like sunsetting some of those and no longer supporting them. So a lot of that is driven not necessarily by the platform itself, but by which applications are still in use at studios. If you're using an ancient version of Maya or side effects or something else that requires an older version of Qt or Python, studios are going to keep that alive internally. That's a bit of a decision that essentially there's a balance where I don't know that there's a ton of value in forcing individual studios to push forward if they're not running into trouble using something that they've already invested in. What we really try to do, just with the general process in general, is tell vendors that, sometimes, like I said, if they release early in the year, it's challenging to adopt the very latest CY version of the reference platform. And so what we ask is, don't introduce yet another combination of the matrix. Try to stick to either the previous year's version or the next year, but at least stick to the set versions that your clients are used to dealing with. And that's how we reduce a little bit of the complexity. But then if that application remains in use for another 1 or 2 years, and certainly that's not uncommon to drag on for a bit, especially with entrenched workflows where there aren't a lot of resources to update that to something new, there isn't necessarily an effort to push for that. I think the vendors certainly have a lot of metrics around which of their older versions are in play, and that could help inform, I think, just from an informational point of view, a sense of what's still in use, which in turn informs a lot of our own community open source projects to know, like, well, if I deprecate this thing and force, C++ 14, this is the percentage of users that can't use my library, and at least right now. that's, I think, interesting information to gather, and something that's, again, also useful in the context of the Academy Software Foundation. But it's not necessarily something where we would push for deprecation from a VFX reference platform point of view. Nick, I don't know if you feel differently.
No, I agree, and I think, you know, definitely, again, we will listen to the needs of the community and see what the issues are, and again, we can start, you know, evolving our philosophy and the goals of the platform, but currently, yeah, I don't think we're pushing to do that. Just to address a couple of other questions I saw, you know, where do all the major vendors stand with respect to the Python 3 builds? If you go to the vfxplatform.com website, under useful links, there is a link to a Google spreadsheet that is kind of open to the community to update, which has all the kind of open source and commercial products and where they stand with respect to Python 3 readiness. So, and thanks to JF, we just posted the link in the Q&A there if you don't want to click on it directly. What else was I going to answer? So is the goal to skip to straight to 3.9? I guess this is Python 3.9 in CY 2022. I'm concerned because Python is on yearly releases now. Yeah, I can't say yes, that's the goal, but I think that logically that would be the way we would go. Is that if we're not moving to 3.8 for next year, that we would be ready to go to the latest stable supported release in the following year of 22. You know, assuming we can work it out with the vendors to get there. But yeah, definitely that's a goal, to get to that point where we can stay with the latest release each year. Now that every vendor is starting to roll out USD support, wouldn't it be a good time to add it to the VFX platform as well? This has definitely come up a lot. And USD is an interesting one. It's a big, complex library that's moving, and set of tools that's moving really, really fast. We don't want to hold that back. So, you know, it's one of those things that's actually, you know, moving fast enough. And this is definitely a challenge for the software vendors. It's a challenge for the community. And it's still trying to find its place, and you know, and it has a tremendous amount of capabilities that they're getting battle proven in production right now. And that's resulting in more changes. So I think it's too soon for it to be part of the platform and for us to be saying, hey, everyone should stick on one release for a whole 12 months. I think that would be challenging. I think it would hold back progress for the industry. So I think we're kind of, we'll, you know, the trade-off there is actually a little bit of chaos, or not chaos, maybe too bad, but a little bit of instability and kind of version issues is kind of okay in the early days, because what you get in return is a faster pace of development. And then maybe a little bit further down, we would look to give some guidance on USD compatibility as part of the platform.
Maybe the one question that Nick, you touched upon while presenting, but Naren's question about Python 3.7 versus 3.8. Obviously, this is something that we've had discussions about internally, but it's also one where I think there's still an opportunity for the community and the vendors at large to discuss further. I think based on the pros and cons and the importance, I think, to everybody using tools today, really fleshing that out on VFX Platform Discuss would be a really good next step to get a sense of how much benefit versus pain is incurred in comparing the two, and help set the stage for the final decision that we're hoping to make in a few weeks.
Yeah, and I will share. Thanks, Francois. I agree. And you know, when you post on VFX Platform Discuss, know that a lot of influential people in all the major software vendors are reading what you post there. So even if they're not able to respond, definitely they will hear that feedback. Another question, should Clang be considered as an alternative on Linux versus GCC, or being somewhat compatible with it somehow? Unreal Engine 4 use Clang on Linux, Google Filament mandates Clang. So actually you can use Clang. We just happen to specify GCC, but you can actually, if you build Clang with that version of GCC we specify, you know, studios are having good experience doing that and using that build of Clang to create compatible software. And that's something that we need to look in a bit more in terms of broadening how we define binary compatibility on Linux. We didn't really get too much into that this year because we were so focused on macOS and Windows. But and I think there's on the website, if you look at the footnote for GCC 9 that we added recently, I think it does talk a little bit about how to build a little bit like building Clang with GCC to get some level of binary compatibility.
I think we've actually covered most of the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Feel free to reach out in the chat as well.
Yeah, there's a good note from Nathan saying, don't recommend mixing Visual C++ 14.0 with VCC 14.1. So yeah, and I think we're not, because now I think we're specifying, I can't remember the exact thing, but Visual Studio 2017, I think that basically implies Visual C++ 14.0 isn't going to be supported and shouldn't be used. We talk a lot about OpenGL, but nothing about Metal on macOS. Yes, that's right. I think most software products have targeted OpenGL because it's been cross-platform and it gives you a broad surface to be able to reach a broad audience. Obviously, when you're targeting to Metal, you get all the benefits of the Metal brings, but you're limiting to a particular, or a narrow set of platforms. So it's really trade-offs that the vendors have to make. I think as we think about the purpose and mission of the VFX Reference Platform, we're trying to find levels of compatibility that are more kind of cross-platform and open and flexible. Who knows, later down the line, we may get to more kind of like platform-specific recommendations as well, but that we're not there yet. Great, I think that's it for all the questions. So yeah, with that, for anyone who's attending SIGGRAPH, attending in this virtual world, we do have a Birds of a Feather next week, where we will go, we'll recap of some of these things, but we'll dive a bit deeper into some of the topics as well, and hopefully have some time for more discussion for anyone who wants to come and join that, and you're participating in SIGGRAPH. But thanks again to the Academy Software Foundation for hosting us. Thanks, Francois, and thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.